Hello, and welcome to another Speed History from the Intro to Documentary Studies with me, Joy Salyers. As I'm recording this, it's a beautiful spring day in the middle of North Carolina, which means it's also pollen season. So hopefully, I will not struggle too much to keep the pollen at bay. So I always like to say before I start one of these kind of speed histories that I call them that for a reason. They are not intended to be a comprehensive overview. Hopefully you will hear some things or learn about some aspect of, in this case, photography that makes you curious and encourages you to go and find out more about it on your own. So this is a way for those of you who maybe don't know as much about documentary photography or maybe just kind of know what you like and haven't had an opportunity to put it in context, to learn a little bit about some of the dots and how they might connect. That's the goal here. So one more thing before we dive in, I want to give a special thanks to my friend and colleague and fellow folklorist, Nancy Kalo. I saw her do a presentation on documentary photography that definitely was a inspiration for this one. And if you have the opportunity to take a class with Nancy, I would highly recommend it. Her presentation went into much more depth than mine will, but I want to give her a shout out for kind of giving me a framework. So let's start with just a brief sketch of early history of photography, because it really affects how photography ends up being seen in the documentary world and in the art world. Daguerreotypes started in about 1839, and they were printed on plates. Developing the plate, getting the plate ready to be able to use it, took up to half an hour. And as you probably know, there was no flash at this time, and you had to have a very long exposure of light onto the plate to make the picture. So the subjects needed to remain very still for several minutes. For people, that meant you were really talking about studio photography, and you've seen these early studio poses. Another interesting thing about early photography is there wasn't an easy way to copy photographs, to make prints, to reproduce them. So you often saw in early photography that even, say, a staff photographer for the newspaper would go and make pictures, bring them back, and then the staff artist would draw the picture to be put into the newspaper so that it could be reproduced on the printing press. You also sometimes see even like woodcuts of photographs in the early days, and that's why. Shortly after that, additional innovations came along in ambrotypes and tintypes. These used glass plates or cheaper metal plates, and they allowed paper prints to be made. Then in 1884, George Eastman brought in the innovation of film over plates, which made things more portable and more affordable. And then by 1901, you had the development of the Kodak Brownie. So you can see here in just like 60 years, you went from photography being a pretty rarefied, not easily accessible art form that required a kind of journeyman skill and technique to something that any middle class household could have in their home. And that did affect the way photography was seen. It became associated a lot with photojournalism, with newspapers, and then with kind of hobbyist snapshots. And some people used its availability, its wide availability, as a way of kind of denigrating it in terms of a fine art medium. So sometimes you'll see the way photography is viewed and talked about is contested in ways that aren't the same for other documentary media, and that's partly why. So I just want to look at 3 examples of really early documentary photography genres or kind of themes, what people chose to focus on. And those are landscapes and war photography and portraiture. And then look at how early photography was used as social change. And all of these motifs or themes continue today. And again, I don't mean to say these are the only themes, but we're just kind of sketching out some ground here so that as you're investigating documentary photography, you can think a little bit about how what you see today might be informed by this history. So let's start with landscapes. Now, first of all, why do you think landscapes were a popular subject for early documentary photography? If you said because they don't move, you're right. Remember, you're looking for things that will hold still for long periods of time. And so the land was a great thing to use. But even the land did not always cooperate. This is a photograph by William Henry Jackson of Mount of the Holy Cross. So this is a famous mountain where in the certain times of the year let's see if I can draw this here. You can see that the snow settles down into these cracks and makes the shape of a cross. This was something that was a popular subject for painting, and so Jackson wanted to capture it in a photograph. Well, when he first went to do that, at this particular time of year, the weather was too bad and the ground was too muddy for him to get to this particular vantage point from which you can see this effect. And when conditions improved and he went back, the snow had actually melted out of one of the arms of the cross. And so he actually put it back in the darkroom. So this is a very early example in 1873 already of photo manipulation. We think of that sometimes as an effect of Photoshop, but that's not true. And so you can wonder about this. You remember if you watched the presentation on documentary film that Robert Flaherty, who made Nanook of the North, argued that often a documentary artist has to manipulate reality in order to convey the true essence of something. So, you know, Jackson would say, well, it really did look like that. I wasn't making it other than what it was. I had to manipulate it in order to convey the true sense of what it looked like. What do you think about that? Do you feel like it's cheating? You should have waited till the next year and gone back and tried again? Or is that acceptable? And that's an interesting thing for you to ponder for yourself. This is another example of landscape photography by Edward Weston, also a very famous artist. And you see some themes in his work that repeat through a lot of Weston's work and are also often seen in landscape photography in general. For example, you have the picture kind of split, in this case kind of split between the water and the land. Sometimes also you see split between the land and then the sky. So that's kind of a common thing. Also, Weston really liked to have everything in focus. So you'll notice that what's here in the foreground and what's far away are equally in focus. And that was the way he kind of showed his technical prowess. And then you're probably familiar with Ansel Adams' work. And this is an interesting one that blurs the lines between fine art and documentary art. So would you consider Ansel Adams a fine art photographer or a documentary photographer, and why? So you can see how it can be a little hard. These aren't neat classifications. Adams really loved light, as you can see, you know, really looking for these dramatic elements here. And that kind of leads us to what I like to call the Facebook effect of landscape photography. When we come into the present day, if you've ever seen a Facebook meme, they usually have these really extreme landscapes where the dramatic lighting is taken, to its utmost. In this one, you kind of have two completely different sky appearances here that almost don't seem like they're from the same picture. You also have, it's this kind of hyper real, ultra saturated effect where the blue will be as blue as it can possibly be. The greens are super green, it's almost an impossible look that is more full saturated than you could even see in real life. And we've gotten kind of used to seeing these because they're everywhere. And so it's interesting to think about how this adjusts our expectations for photography and for landscape, what we want the land to look like. Another thing you see often are these unrealistic shadows where every aspect of the picture is lit kind of to its best effect. Whereas if you just took a regular photograph of this, probably if you got this, really bright stuff back here, the tree in the front would be almost a silhouette. But so to get, where even under the shadows under the fence and the tree in the foreground and all of these things are kind of perfectly exposed, it's not really realistic. And this leads to changes in the way we see landscape photography being done today, what I call kind of the hyper real. So this is a photograph, and again, you see this hyper blue sky, this fully saturated yellow-orange building, the red bus, and you wonder, would it really look like that if I went there? Is that what it really looks like? Or are we doing something else than documenting at this point? With our photography. Again, you see here how you can see all of the underside of the arch is well lit, and back here is well lit. Nothing's in shadow to where it can't be seen. And this is a really interesting example, and if you go to the additional reading from this presentation on the website, you'll find a link to an article by this artist, Ignacio Palacios, where he really argues that the idea that manipulation is somehow bad is an unfair idea, because he says all photography is a manipulation. Just choosing, what exposure to use, where to point your camera, what time of day to go, all of these things are ways that you affect what the photograph will look like. And so how far do you take editing and touching up before it becomes something you feel is duplicitous or just too much? Lots and lots of photographers take their work into Photoshop, and they'll often say, clean it up a little, right? So when does cleaning it up a little end and making it something different than what it originally was begin? You'll find in my class, I often say I don't have answers for very many things or one right way to do things, but I do think it's very important that you know for yourself what your personal work ethic is, and that you can articulate it to yourself and to the people with whom you're working. So I think it's important to ask this question of yourself, because these decisions will come up and you want to know how you'll respond to them. So I'm not going to tell you the answer of what this original photo looked like, but if you go and follow the link, you can see the untouched photo and then this one, which has been processed with Photoshop. And I'd be curious to know what you think of it, if you feel like it is acceptable, if it goes too far. And I'm guessing that even if you're imagining right now a really extreme edit, that probably you'll still be surprised when you see the original and how much he's done with it. And then that takes us back to definition again. Is it that it's fine as a photograph, but it's no longer a documentary photograph? And so kind of what do we mean by putting that term documentary on something? What qualities are we expecting from a photograph that we label a documentary photograph? So it's something else for you to kind of think about. So let's turn now to a second very early focus as a subject for documentary photography, which was war. The Civil War was the first extensively documented war in history because it happened right after the advent of photography. And Matthew Brady was very instrumental in this. He had a studio, and he had his assistants and staff going out and documenting the war very exhaustively. And a lot of photographs we have from the Civil War come from the work of him or at his encouragement or insistence. So this is a photograph by Alexander Gardner, who worked for Matthew Brady. This is after the Battle of Antietam. and it's called Confederate Soldier at Devil's Den. And a few things to notice about it as you kind of read the photograph. So look at it, you know, from the standpoint of composition, for example. A couple things you'll notice. You've got these elements of the landscape photography we were just looking at here, and we're kind of seeing for the first time this addition of the human form. What is foregrounded is the dead body. And early war photography, again, because the subject needed to hold still for prolonged periods, was not capturing the excitement or trauma of battle, but really instead documenting its aftermath. So it was mostly photos of dead bodies and horses, of destroyed buildings, of carts, things like that. So we have here this Confederate soldier, and you see his head is turned, and if you had if his eyes were open, you know, he would be kind of looking up to heaven, so his gaze is kind of going heavenward. So we're presented with this sympathetic image of this person who's died. There's a lot of pathos here. His arms are thrown open. He's very vulnerable and exposed. His legs are open. And yet we have here the gun very prominently placed and lit to remind us that he was the enemy. So this is a complicated message. It's not kind of this propagandist, this person's evil, this person's good, but saying war is horrible and this is a real person who's died, and it's sad, and also he was potentially dangerous because he was armed, he was a combatant, and he was, kind of on the wrong side. So even in this kind of simple and early photograph, there's a lot going on in terms of directing the audience's meaning making from the image. Now here's another photo by Gardner of the same battle. This one's often called Rebel Sharpshooter. And you see the similar kind of theme here. The story implied is that he was standing here at his post shooting and was shot mortally and fell back and died. And again, his eyes are turned to the heavens. In this case, interestingly, his face is turned to the camera. So we're asked to look at his face, so at his humanity, and see his vulnerability and feel that kind of sympathy and pathos. But again, look at the composition of this photograph. You've got these angles directing your attention right here to the gun, which is center in the photo, propped up, reminding us again that he is a potentially dangerous person. He had to be killed. He was on the wrong side. So as you look at these two photos, what do you notice? I'll give you a few seconds. You might be realizing that it's the same person. And not only that, it's actually the same gun. So apparently, Gardner and his assistants dragged the body from its original location to this one and staged this shot, set it up here. This gun is not actually the kind of rifle that Confederate soldiers used, so it was most likely a photographer's prop that was placed there. So now you realize then that is a very intentional and conscious aspect of meaning making, saying, it might be a little too sympathetic. We need to have something there to make sure we're making the point that don't feel too bad for him. Don't start feeling bad about the Union cause because he was on the other side after all. He was going to shoot us if we didn't shoot him. There's a lot of speculation about why he moved bodies and staged them, that perhaps he arrived a little late and a lot of bodies had already been buried or removed, and so he didn't have as much to work with. But it is pretty well known that this kind of staging was going on. Now, you could do a whole class just on war photography, and I don't want to get too much in it, but thinking about the effect of photographing war on public attitudes to war and some of the innovations in photography that have come from war photography, I think is interesting. And again, if that's intriguing to you, there's a lot of information you can pursue about it. I do want to look, though, at just one example of a photograph from the Vietnam War. One thing that really happened here is when you started really having color documentary photography used, you had a very different effect of war. So seeing the blood in its, goriness, seeing the jungle, the mud, the sweat, uh, all of these things really represented in, Technicolor, um, brought home the misery and the just depth of the ugliness and the kind of muck. This was not glamorous, right? In a really different way. So this is a very famous photograph called Reaching Out, and you see how it speaks to so many different things, not just the dangers of war and being wounded, but kind of camaraderie, the just the conditions that people were struggling in, reaching out for each other is just a very powerful. Larry Burroughs was the photographer who made this picture, and he himself was killed during the war shortly afterwards. Whenever we talk about genres or themes, these are always somewhat arbitrary categories. And so, here you have an example where there's war photography that's also portraiture. So Matthew Brady, who had the studio, did a lot of portraits of famous people, Abraham Lincoln, Edgar Allan Poe, and he did portraits of well-known military figures as well. These are Ulysses S. Grant and Custer. And a few things you'll notice about them. You don't often see people smiling in early studio photography. That's partly because you had to hold very still. These are not candid shots, they're very posed. Also because early photography was kind of taken seriously. It was a big deal. It was a momentous, documenting. So it wasn't particularly something to, take lightheartedly. You see, in studio photography, people get to choose how they represent themselves, what they want to put on, and they get to help define how the audience views them, with their clothes, with their stance, with their expression. It's interesting to notice that neither of these men are looking at the camera. You can go back and look at the history of portraiture and even into painted portraits, and when people look directly into the viewer's gaze and when they don't, and kind of what the different effects are. You get this kind of look of someone looking off into the distance, as a visionary leader perhaps, or someone interested in something that's off frame. Maybe you're not worth my attention, but I'm paying attention to what's going on over here because I'm an alert commander. This is another portrait by Matthew Brady, or from his studio, called Miss Divine, and so he did all kinds of portraits. This is of a young woman, and you see this very soft quality to her. Another important aspect of portraiture is was a boom in African American studio portraiture. It was very exciting for middle class African Americans to have access to black photography studios, and really for the first time for many of them be able to direct their own narrative. So being able to choose how to be presented and what my story is rather than having it told by other people was really welcome. And so there are a lot of really wonderful black studio photographs from this time period, and there have been a couple books written about them. And so we're starting to see a smile here. And again, being able to choose how I want to be represented, how I want you to see me, presenting myself in this way was a really important quality of studio photography in general, but especially for people who had not had that power before. James Van Der Zee is another really well-known black studio photographer. This is from the 1930s, and he did some interesting things. He kind of was a poetic studio photographer, so he combined this more artistic visionary quality with studio work. So in this case, this is a wedding photograph, and he's kind of put in these ghostly, this ghostly child and doll representing their future. You know, this is your future happiness that will be to come. He would also sometimes put in kind of ghostly figures of deceased family members into a family portrait. Another very well-known photographer is Diane Arbus from the 1960s. And Arbus was very interested in the idea of masks. So you'll see a lot of her, the people she photographs are masked in some way. And this idea of how we show ourselves or conceal ourselves from the gaze of others was really interesting to her. So in this case, the man kind of has a mask literally on his face in the form of tattoo work. In this case, the person has a literal mask on. And this moves us into the idea of street portraiture and street photography. So we're coming out of the studio and literally into the streets, making pictures of people where we find them. And Arbus is a well-known artist who works in this genre. This is a very famous photograph of hers, Boy with a Hand Grenade, from 1962. And just, I want to pause here for a moment and ask you to look at the picture and think about what you read in it and what really stands out to you, what you think is going on here and what she's doing here. So usually one of the things students mention right away is there's a lot of tension in this photograph. The clenched hand, this is curled into a claw, this grimace on his face, really tightly pulled mouth. So a lot of tension and angles throughout. So you've got the trees behind him and you've got these angles of light. So even in this kind of soft, dappled treed, background, it's very angular. There's also a sense of kind of disarray, or things are akimbo. His strap is off, his stance is unbalanced, and of course he's holding a toy hand grenade. That adds to the overall feel for sure. And so what do you wonder when you look at this? I know maybe because I'm a mother, the first thing I wonder is, where's his family? Did Diane Arbus just come up to this kid and see him doing this and make his picture? Or was she standing there for a prolonged period of time, snapping away? Was his mom standing right over here out of the frame watching? Or did she not know this was going on? So these are the kinds of things that I want you to start wondering when you look at photographs. I always say part of my job is to ruin enjoying documentaries for you, because you will start needing to not only kind of deconstruct what went into making a documentary the way it is, whether it's a video or a photo or an audio or something else, but also asking questions about it. What's left out? How did it happen? What's outside the frame? So what's right here? What's right here? All of those kinds of questions are important to consider. So to that end, here's the contact sheet from this particular photo shoot. And it's a little small, but I think that you can see some interesting information here. For one thing, obviously, they did a prolonged shoot and tried lots of different poses. So they were working together in some way. We don't know from looking at this if it was collaborative, and he was saying, "What about this?" or if she was telling him, "Try doing that, or some of both. You can see his family here, so that answers one of my questions. You can see Arbus was trying, some different looks. So here she is with a prop, and he's kind of moved slightly in different places, which is one reason I think she was really interested in this light and looking for the composition of using the light as part of the structure of the photograph itself. You can see that his overalls are not down in every photo, and some they're up and some they're down. And so it leads to the question of, what happens when you take this scene, this moment, series of moments in time, and from it extract only this photo to tell the story. Is that really representative of this experience, of this event? It certainly happened. It was there. I always wonder, what did this man, when he grew up, think of this being the only well-known representation of him, kind of for all eternity. And you can read interviews with people who have been one of those kind of iconic pictures about what that feels like, to be kind of reduced to this one image. So that's an interesting thing to think about too, that often we're used to seeing one photo coming out of a whole series, as this is the iconic photo that captures this whole moment, as opposed to something like a photo essay where you feel like you have to have more pictures to understand this story. And this photo is another famous one, and we'll talk more about this one when we talk about legal issues, but this is by a photographer called Philip de Corsia, and he was actually making photos of people as they came up out of the subway in New York. And so not only were they being photographed in a public space, but they didn't even know their picture was being taken. So you go from, being photographed in a public space where there's some level of collaboration and awareness and knowledge, although this kid didn't have any say-so in, in the editing of how he was represented and what got picked, to not even having a say-so about your photo being taken at all. So that's an interesting trend too. And as we move into the class and think about aspects of, whether you want to work collaboratively or not, and what kinds of work you feel comfortable with and you enjoy, looking at these different approaches, I think, can be helpful. So last, I want to talk a little bit about photography for social change. And this, almost from the advent of photography itself, people saw its potential value in documenting problems to try to help correct them. So we're going to look at two people who did this very famously. One is Jacob Riis, and the other is Louis Hine. Jacob Riis was very concerned about the situation of immigrants, largely living in New York City. There was a large wave of immigration, especially from Europe, and owners of apartment buildings would split an apartment into two. And as more people came, they would split it again, putting up cheap, flimsy walls, and make it then 4 apartments. And they would continue doing this until the interior apartments had no windows and no direct access to the outside. You had to sometimes walk through other people's homes to get to a door from which you could get to the stairs from which you could get outside. So they were huge fire hazards, health hazards, overcrowding, rats, garbage, all kinds of issues, if someone got sick, it was going to spread very quickly. This kind of overcrowding was a big issue, and he wanted to reform the housing laws. To do that, Riis went into these neighborhoods and made a lot of photos. And he's an example of someone who took them to the paper, where they were then reproduced in illustration and published. And so this was how kind of New York got to know and think about the people who lived in these tenements. And knowing what you know now about early documentary photography, and that people had to hold still for long periods of time, what does that tell you about a photograph like this one? That's right. There is some level at which these people must be agreeing to and participating in the photograph, right? So it was not possible for him to come up on somebody being mugged and, quickly snap that picture. So in fact, he would pay children in cigarettes to pose for him and let him make their pictures. So these are children that are supposedly sleeping outside, unprotected, but it was photographed in the middle of the day to have the light. Another thing Riis did, you see here, this photo was titled Growler Gang in Session, is he would title his photographs and have text that went with them describing very pointedly how he wanted you, the viewer, to understand this picture and how to interpret it. He was very concerned with the idea of unattended children and absent mothers, particularly. He was a good Victorian, and mothers were really held in this kind of revered sense, and it really bothered him that that ideal was not being upheld. So this is the home of an Italian rag picker, and I think it's really a beautiful picture, actually. But for him, I think it was almost a kind of a caricature of, the Mary holding the baby, this kind of taking care of your child, but then you live in a place that's dirty and doesn't have real furniture and isn't really, you can't really provide a home for that child. So he was documenting the reality here. You see, these kids really are dirty and don't have clothes that fit, and their clothes are torn. He's not making that up. But how is he asking the viewer to think about these people that he's photographing? Is he looking at them sympathetically or critically? And I think you can see that he has a pretty critical gaze. In fact, he was pretty negative toward the people he was photographing. Even while he was working for social betterment for their conditions, he saw them as really part of the problem, that they were uncivilized and dirty, and he had a lot of prejudice. This is kind of a whole theme of his, this kind of minding the baby, that you had children taking care of other children. And, the way the Victorian viewer would read this is, where is the mother? And of course, the mother was probably working, right? It's not like she was off having fun. So here's an example of what I mean about him kind of using the title to direct your understanding. This one's called Bandit's Roost. And if you didn't see that title there, would you think this was a particularly menacing photograph? I don't know. I guess you can see these kind of shadowy guys in the front as a little bit threatening, and this guy at first looks like he might be holding a club or something. But then if you think about it again, if you were really the alleyway of bandits, would you be leaning out of your windows and facing the camera, posing for the picture? Probably not. These are just people hanging their wash out, trying to get by. Riis was successful in making social change through his work. And another interesting story about him, he was one of the very first users of flash photography. And the way you ignited the flash in the early days was to literally ignite it and explode it. It was like a gunshot. So he would go with the landlord's permission into some of those interior rooms to photograph how overcrowded they were, and kind of ask everyone to turn toward where he was because it was dark and they couldn't see, and then he would basically set off this gun this explosion in the room and blind them all with this bright light, and get that picture made. So you start right there with the idea that we'll see come up again and again of the ways that photography can sometimes feel like having a gun pointed at you. It can sometimes feel um, like being accosted. It can feel there can be a sense of violation to it. The other example I want to show you is Lewis Hine. And Lewis Hine is somebody that the folks at the Center for Documentary Studies really admire, and there's actually a Hine Fellowship. He was very concerned with child labor, and he documented child labor in lots of different cities. And at first glance, these look kind of similar to the photos we were just looking at of Jacob Riis. But as we go along, you might see some differences. One thing you'll notice is this is a much more just kind of factual statement as a title. These are newsboys. This is the night shift at a glass factory, and a couple of things you notice about this. This is what happens if people don't hold still long enough. You see some blurriness and movement. What Hine wanted you to notice is how little and young some of these boys are. There are a lot of photographs that Hine made in North Carolina because of our textile mills, and so you'll often see exhibits of his work in places around North Carolina, and encourage you to look at them if you get the chance. So you see here, this is a portrait. These boys are looking directly at the camera. We're kind of asked to see them as people, and he has their names here. That's definitely not something you saw in Jacob Riis's work. You also get the sense that they had some say-so in how they were going to present themselves. Even though maybe their clothes are not fine or in great shape, they have their coats on. They are trying to be neat and clean and look presentable. Hine did direct his audience's understanding sometimes, but usually in very compassionate and sympathetic ways. So in this case, he says this is 7-year-old Ferris, a tiny newsboy who did not even know enough to make change for the investigator. There are still too many of these little ones in the larger cities. So he is looking at this child with compassion. And, just look at this picture for a moment and think from a technical standpoint, what is it in this picture that creates that sense of compassion? Even if you didn't see the text here, how would you read this picture in a way that's different from those of Riis, perhaps? Because you, as a documentary artist, are going to want to guide your audience toward particular interpretations or readings, right? So it's really important for you to think about how other artists do that. Is it about lighting? Is it about the softness? Is it about where people are positioned? Is it about looking directly into the camera, making that connection? Those are important things to think about. So here you see he's really trying to get child labor laws changed. And I just want to find one more here. Yeah. I think this is a great example of his concern for his subjects' humanity. He allows them to have pride in their jobs. Even though he's saying you shouldn't be doing this job, you're too young, he still understands that they're proud of their work, that they're helping to support their families. They have on their uniforms, they've got their hats on, and then you have this additional poignancy of the button missing. So you can see, I think, in this picture, the real difference in the way he approaches his subjects versus the way Jacob Riis did. And Hein also was very successful in his work in getting child labor laws changed. And what he would do is travel around and do lectures and show these photos and tell the stories, tell the personal stories of these kids and what he saw or what their lives were like, and really create a sense of passion, compassion, sympathy with the audience, and build this upswell to say, this just isn't right. We need to make a change. So I want to close by looking at how the meaning of a photograph can shift over time, even if the photograph itself doesn't change, and also how a photo can be a hybrid form. It can be multiple things at once. I always think it's good to remember things aren't either or. A lot of times, most of the time, things are both and, or it depends. So I don't ever want you to get stuck into thinking I'm trying to put things into neat boxes. Most things don't fit there or stay there well. This is the photographer Edward Burtynsky. Beautiful work. You should go look at his stuff. And he does what he calls manufactured landscapes. So it's landscape photography, but rather than the landscape that's kind of removed from and unspoiled by humanity, it's really the landscape of humanity. What happens when the effects of manufacturing are visited upon the landscape. So his photos are beautiful, but then also kind of disturbing because you see the effects of different things, mining, all different kinds of manufacturing processes on the land. And he really wants this to generate an ecological worldview in his audience. So in that sense, he's kind of doing landscape photography for social change. This is a very famous photograph of the Fat Man bomb going off over Japan. And when it first came out, it was really almost used as propaganda. It was seen as, this is pride in our power and the fact that we ended the war. Yay us. And now, knowing what we do about the devastation of these bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when we see this photograph, we're much more likely to think about the utter devastation of war and the tragedy of lost lives, and how much we want this never to happen again. I'm going to show you two photos by an artist named Lee Jeffries, and this is a series of portraits of people who are homeless. And it's interesting to look at the techniques used and the way the photographer is framing people. What messages do you see here? What do you think Jeffries is trying to do? And how? By what means? I think it's neat that some are black and white and some are color. So you don't have to pick one or the other, and you can mix them even within one project, which I think more people are starting to feel free to do. But one thing you notice is these are super close-ups on people's faces. So we've seen some portraits that were full body or 3/4, or busts. These are really up in people's face, and you're looking directly into their eyes, and they're beautiful. So without needing to be changed or kind of, quote, cleaned up in some way to be presentable, just as they are, whether they're dirty or whether their hair's a little unkempt, they're beautifully photographed, and their beauty really shines through. So as we're asked to look deeply into their eyes, which are the windows of the soul, we're really asked to connect with their humanity. And so I think the message here is to say, don't look at me as an issue or a problem. I'm a person. And how do you relate to talking about homelessness differently if you have that understanding and perspective? So this is an example of kind of portraiture for social change. So I hope you've enjoyed this speed history of documentary photography and that it's given you some things to think about. And I encourage you to go look at the additional resources and links on the website. Till next time, this is Joy signing out.